Beloved brothers and sisters, we gather today under the weight of words, spoken and unspoken, that have sought to wound the soul. Scripture teaches us that words can build or destroy, bless or curse, heal or harm. In Psalm 109, we hear the cry of a righteous heart surrounded by false tongues, accused without cause, opposed without truth. Yet this psalm does not teach us fear. It teaches us refuge. 7 times we return to this psalm, not as a charm, not as a shout of anger, but as an act of steady faith. We return to place every curse before God, because only He judges rightly. We do not repay evil for evil. We surrender it to the one whose justice is pure and whose mercy endures. In doing so, the power of harmful words is broken, not by our strength, but by God's truth. Psalm 109 reminds us that when mouths rise against us, the Lord Himself rises as our defender. When lies surround us, He becomes our shield. When accusations multiply, He speaks a better word over our lives. Curses lose their hold when they meet the faith of a heart that trusts God more than it fears man. So we pray this psalm calmly, faithfully, and repeatedly, not to harden our hearts, but to guard them. We ask God to silence what should never have been spoken, and to cancel what was never sent by Him. And as He does, He replaces bitterness with peace, fear with assurance, and conflict with rest. May the Lord stand at your right hand. May every unjust word fall silent. May every curse be undone by grace. And may your life speak louder than every voice raised against you. Beloved hearts, when we speak of God as the righteous defender, we are not speaking of an idea shaped by human courts or fragile systems of justice. We are speaking of the living God who sees before words are formed, who knows the motive before the action, who weighs the spirit behind every accusation. Who weighs the spirit behind every accusation. To entrust our case to Him is not weakness. It is the deepest act of faith a wounded soul can make. Psalm 109 rises from a place where the speaker is surrounded by unjust words, false witnesses, and relentless hostility. There is no attempt to pretend that pain does not exist. The wounds are named, the betrayal is acknowledged, the injustice is felt deeply. Yet even in that rawness, there is a quiet refusal to take the final judgment into human hands. The psalmist does not become the judge. God remains the judge. This is where true spiritual strength begins. Unjust curses have power only when they are believed, feared, or carried into the inner life. Words spoken in malice seek lodging in the heart, hoping to take root as shame, doubt, or bitterness. But when a believer places every unjust word before God, those words lose their shelter. They cannot survive in the presence of divine truth. God does not require us to defend ourselves endlessly, explaining and re-explaining our innocence to every voice that accuses. He invites us instead to rest our case in His hands, trusting that He knows what others distort and sees what others hide. This trust is not loud. It does not shout back. It does not curse in return. It stands calmly, because it stands on God. Faithful calm is not emotional numbness. It is the settled posture of a heart that has chosen where its safety lies. The psalmist in Psalm 109 feels deeply, yet refuses to surrender to chaos. He prays not to inflame his anger, but to anchor his soul. He speaks to God because God is the only one who can hold both justice and mercy without corruption. This is why entrusting our case to God cancels unjust curses. A curse thrives on disorder, fear, and reaction. Faith introduces order, peace, and surrender. When the heart becomes still before God, curses find no place to cling. God's defense is different from human defense. God's defense is different from human defense. Humans defend by counterattack, by proving others wrong, by preserving reputation at all costs. God defends by revealing truth in His time, by humbling falsehood, and by sustaining the soul of the one who trusts Him. Often the first thing God defends is not our name, but our heart. He shields us from becoming what has attacked us. He protects us from turning into bitterness, from allowing injustice to poison our spirit. In this way, His defense is already a victory before any outward change occurs. Unjust curses often arrive through words that repeat themselves. Accusations spoken once can echo for years if the heart keeps replaying them. Psalm 109 teaches us to interrupt that echo by returning again and again to God. Not once, not hurriedly, but persistently. Each return is an act of trust. Each prayer says, I refuse to carry what does not belong to me. Over time, the voice of accusation weakens, not because the accuser stops speaking, but because the soul stops listening. God's truth grows louder than every lie. There is a mystery in divine justice that requires patience. God does not always silence false mouths immediately. Sometimes He allows them to speak long enough to reveal their own emptiness. Sometimes He allows silence to test whether our faith depends on quick outcomes or on His character. Entrusting our case to God means accepting His timing as part of His righteousness. It means believing that delayed justice is not denied justice. In the waiting, God works inwardly, strengthening the believer's roots so that when the storm passes, the tree still stands. Faithful hearts understand that God's defense does not mean the absence of pain. The psalmist still walks through sorrow, still feels surrounded, still knows what it is to be misunderstood. But pain no longer defines reality. God defines reality. When the believer anchors identity in God, rather than in public opinion, curses lose their authority. A curse can only harm if it is allowed to name you. God has already named you His own. That name is stronger than any accusation spoken in malice. There is also humility in this trust. To place our case before God is to admit that we cannot fully defend ourselves without losing something precious. We might win an argument and lose our peace. We might win an argument and lose our peace. We might clear our name and harden our heart. God's defense preserves what truly matters. He guards the soul, the conscience, and the quiet integrity that no false word can erase. This humility does not deny injustice. It simply refuses to let injustice become the ruler of the heart. Psalm 109 shows us that prayer itself becomes a boundary. When accusations press in, prayer pushes back, not with violence, but with truth. Each prayer draws a line that curses cannot cross. Each word spoken to God lifts the burden off the shoulders of the believer and places it where it belongs. God never grows weary of receiving these burdens. He invites them. He knows that a soul burdened with unspoken pain becomes vulnerable to despair. Prayer is how God defends us from that inward collapse. Unjust curses also seek to isolate. They whisper that you are alone, that no one sees, that no one understands. Entrusting your case to God breaks that isolation. It restores relationship. Even when human support fails, divine presence remains. The psalmist speaks to God as one who is near, attentive, and involved. This nearness is itself a defense. A heart aware of God's presence is not easily overtaken by fear. It may tremble, but it does not break. Calm faith does not mean passive acceptance of evil. It means active trust in divine justice. The believer continues to live rightly, love sincerely, and walk humbly, not because the world is fair, but because God is faithful. This steady righteousness exposes the emptiness of curses over time. Lies cannot endure beside consistent truth. Accusations lose force when they are not fed by reaction. God's defense often works quietly, steadily, and irresistibly, like light slowly overtaking darkness. There is also healing in this process. When we stop defending ourselves endlessly, our wounded places begin to rest. The soul is not designed to live in constant self-justification. It was designed to live in trust. God's defense gives the soul permission to rest, even while circumstances remain unresolved. This rest is not denial. It is confidence. It says, God is at work even when I cannot see how. Entrusting our case to God also reshapes how we see our enemies. Psalm 109 is honest about opposition, yet it places that opposition under God's authority. The believer no longer needs to dehumanize the accuser or become consumed by resentment. God handles justice without hatred. When we allow Him to defend us, our hearts are freed from carrying judgments we were never meant to bear. This freedom is part of how curses are cancelled. A curse fueled by hatred cannot survive in a heart that chooses surrender. Over time, something quiet but powerful happens. The believer's life becomes a testimony stronger than any spoken defense. Peace replaces agitation. Integrity replaces desperation. Steadfastness replaces fear. Those who once spoke unjustly may fall silent, not because they were confronted, but because there is nothing left to accuse. God's defense reshapes reality from the inside out. In the end, the righteous defender does not merely cancel unjust curses. He transforms the believer through the process. The calm that grows is not fragile. It is rooted. The faith that deepens is not naive. It is tested. To entrust our case to God is to step into a protection that no human strategy can offer. It is to stand, even while surrounded, knowing that the final word does not belong to the accuser, but to God. Beloved souls, when accusations rise and harmful words are released, they often arrive not as a single blow, but as a steady pressure, wearing down the heart over time. Words spoken against us have a way of lingering, repeating themselves in the mind long after the voice that spoke them has gone silent. They attempt to define us, to corner us into fear, to make us doubt what God has already spoken over our lives. The second truth we hold is this: when such voices rise, God Himself takes His place, and in His presence, false words lose their authority. He does not marrow. He answers the accuser. He replaces the noise with peace, truth, and restoration. The silence God brings is not always immediate, and it is rarely dramatic. The silence God brings is not always immediate. Often it begins within. Before the mouths around us are quieted, the voice of fear within us is stilled. This is where divine work usually starts. Harmful words gain strength when they echo inside the soul, when they are rehearsed in anxious thought, when they are feared as if they carry final judgment. But God speaks a deeper word, one that settles beneath the surface of the heart. When that word is received, the power of accusation begins to fade, even if the sound of it still exists outside. God's truth does not argue with lies in the way humans do. It does not chase them down or wrestle them into submission. Truth simply stands, and in its presence, falsehood weakens. This is why the believer is invited to remain close to God rather than close to the conflict. The nearer the soul draws to divine truth, the less room there is for harmful words to dwell. God's voice does not compete, it replaces. Fear is replaced with assurance. Confusion is replaced with clarity. Restlessness is replaced with peace. Accusations often aim at the most vulnerable parts of the heart. They strike where there has already been pain, loss, or uncertainty. Harmful words exploit wounds that have not yet healed. God knows this, and he does not shame the wounded soul for feeling shaken. Instead, he draws near as a healer. His silence of false mouths is not only an act of justice, it is an act of mercy. He understands that a heart under constant accusation cannot easily rest, and so he becomes both defender and comforter. When God silences unjust words, he does not always remove the speaker immediately. Sometimes he removes their influence instead. Their words may still be spoken, but they no longer penetrate. They no longer command attention. They lose their emotional weight. This is a quiet miracle, often unnoticed at first. The believer realizes one day that what once caused sleepless nights now passes by without power. What once stirred fear now meets a calm refusal to engage. This is not indifference, it is healing. Restoration follows this inner silence. As fear loosens its grip, space is created for peace to take root. Peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of God within it. This peace guards the heart from becoming hardened or cynical. It keeps the believer tender without being fragile. Harmful words seek to turn the heart inward in self-defense, but God's peace opens the heart outward again, making room for trust, compassion, and steady hope. Truth also restores identity. Accusations try to rename us. They attempt to reduce a life to a rumor, a failure, or a misrepresentation. God restores by reminding us who we are in him. This reminder is not always spoken aloud. Often it is felt as a quiet confidence that refuses to collapse. The believer begins to live from God's affirmation rather than from human approval. When this shift occurs, false words lose their ability to shape the future. God's silence of harmful mouths sometimes comes through exposure. Lies cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. Over time, inconsistency reveals them. Motives are uncovered. Truth emerges without force. The believer who remains faithful and calm does not need to orchestrate this exposure. God handles it in ways that preserve the soul from unnecessary bitterness. The timing belongs to him, and though waiting can be painful, it protects the heart from acting out of wounded pride. Fear is one of the first things God replaces. Accusations generate fear because they threaten belonging, security, and worth. God answers this fear with presence. He does not always explain every situation, but he reassures the heart that it is not abandoned. This assurance steadies the believer. Fear loses its sharpness when the soul knows it is held. Even in uncertainty, there is a sense of being guarded. As fear fades, peace deepens. This peace is not fragile or dependent on circumstances. It is anchored in trust. The believer learns to sleep again, to breathe again, to pray without anxiety. Harmful words no longer dictate emotional rhythms. Peace becomes a quiet strength, allowing the believer to continue loving, serving, and walking forward without being consumed by what was said behind their back or thrown against them. Restoration also touches relationships. Accusations isolate, making the believer feel misunderstood or unsafe. God restores by rebuilding trust, sometimes slowly, sometimes unexpectedly. New connections form. Old wounds soften. Even when certain relationships cannot be repaired, The believer no longer lives defined by their loss. God's restoration is not about returning everything to how it was, but about bringing the soul into a healthier, truer place. There is a profound dignity in how God silences false words. He does not humiliate in return. He does not crush for the sake of victory. His justice is clean, untainted by cruelty. This protects the believer from rejoicing in another's downfall. The heart remains aligned with God's character, free from the corrosion of revenge. In this way, the believer is restored not only from harm, but from becoming hardened by it. Over time, the believer's life itself becomes the answer to accusation. Steadfast faith, consistent integrity, and quiet endurance speak louder than defense. God allows the fruit of a life to contradict the lie. This kind of vindication does not inflate the ego. It humbles the heart. The believer recognizes that survival, peace, and growth were not self-produced but divinely sustained. The self, the says, hutting of harmful mouths also includes the inner critic that often echoes external accusation. God gently silences self-condemnation. He replaces harsh inner speech with grace. This may take time, but it is part of restoration. A heart constantly accusing itself cannot fully receive peace. God teaches the believer to speak to their own soul with the same patience He shows them. In this process, trust matures. The believer learns that God can be relied upon even when misunderstood, even when wronged, even when silence stretches long. This trust becomes a foundation for future trials. The soul that has seen God silence falsehood once can stand more firmly the next time words rise against it. In the end, when accusations fall away and harmful words lose their grip, what remains is not merely relief, but transformation. The believer is quieter, deeper, more grounded. Fear has been replaced with peace, confusion with truth, and fragmentation with restoration. God has not only silenced the mouths that rose against His child, He has strengthened the heart that endured them. And that heart now knows, beyond doubt, that no words spoken in malice can overcome the truth God speaks in love.